Too often do we hear that gameplay matters most, while the story or lore is nothing more than a detail, nothing more than an afterthought in a world of video games where interactivity and fun must prevail. Too often, then, do we discard the one thing games out to do more and to do better. Story is the glue that holds everything together, whether in cinema, painting, literature, etc. Video games are no exception. In fact, games should be at the forefront of new and original forms of storytelling, considering how we only scratch the surface of what they can do. Story is not an option, and it's more important than ever, which is why I intend to demonstrate by starting with one of the most memorable and puzzling scenes in video game history. That scene comes from Final Fantasy XV, when Prince Noctis, at the beginning of the game, learns about his father's death. The scene is famous because it depicts an awkward storytelling moment, in that a significant and dramatic event, the death of the king, is expedited and reduced to a piece of information. More precisely, the characters hear about this when they get their hands on a journal recounting the event.
What's that look for?
It's in all the papers.
What is? Insomnia Falls. What? This your idea of a joke?
I need you to calm down so I can explain.
I'm as calm as I'm gonna get.
There was an attack. The Imperial Army has taken the Crown City.
As treaty room tempers flared, blast lit the night sky. When the smoke about the Citadel had cleared, the king was found dead.
No, wait. Hold on.
When Gladio reads the newspaper containing the tragic news out loud, the plot is reduced to data, to something that can be summarized in a few detached words. The golden rule of storytelling, embodied in the expression show, don't tell, is nowhere to be seen, and players have no choice but to hear about the plot like we hear about the local news, in an unceremonious and clumsy manner. The journal in the hands of Gladio epitomizes the scene all too well. Narration is nothing more than exposition, and storytelling now consists in nothing more than sharing the latest news with a player. Contrast this with the beginning of The Last of Us and the death of Sarah. Loss here is shown, not told, as the sadness Joel feels transcends words. The death of a family member is not a piece of information we just hear about. It is felt, it is both silent and loud, it is displayed in all its tragedy. If we were to recount Sarah's death by just stating, Sarah dies, the statement would utterly fail at conveying how strong the incident truly is. Reducing the intensity of a tragic moment to a brief and cold statement is precisely what happens to the narration of FF15, but also to many video games nowadays that do storytelling without the story. This essay comes at a time when many players keep debating over what the most important elements of a game are. Should gameplay be set the stage, or should it be the graphics? And how important can lore or story be in a medium that gives so much control to players who can break the immersion in a second? This video addresses a crucial and hurtful misconception. Wanting gameplay to be central in games is very much understandable, just like it is understandable to want a good story. But both of these things are not mutually exclusive. No matter how important gameplay or graphics can be in any game, story is not something that games can do without. In other words, story cannot be discarded and skipped to the benefit of other things. If anything, story is at the heart of any and all artistic works, of any and all digital experiences. Story is not optional, and it's time to understand why. To start our investigation proper, we may want to ask ourselves the most important question of all: what is story? A quick look at the word and its definition indicates a narrative of some sort, bringing to life fictional and non-fictional events. It also indicates a description of events and people, either written or told, and whose goal is to entertain. But story may also mean a widely circulated rumor, a recounting of facts and news, a legend from an old age, etc. In truth, and no matter how we see it, story is that which cannot be fully defined. It takes so many different forms and it tells so many different things that reducing it to a few definitions wouldn't do it justice. What is certain is the fact that story is malleable, that it shifts and changes from person to person, from work to work. There are as many stories and types of stories as there are people and things in the world. If we agree on a loose identity of what a story is, we may now understand that a work of art, for example, doesn't contain one story. Rather, it contains an infinite number of stories. The author tried to tell one, yes, but then a different story emerges whenever a reader is involved. With each new reading of a story comes a new interpretation, that is, a twist on the original story which deforms it and makes it new. Without diving into details, Roland Barthes' essay The Death of the Author helps understand better the idea that the reader participates in the creation of a story just as much as the author. In addition, with each story comes the story of how it came to be, its origins, which participates in the meaning of any work. And it doesn't end here, because we can also think of all the circumstances surrounding the publication of a story, which add to the meaning of the work and what it tries to say. A painting, for instance, will tell a different story depending on where it is exhibited, but also depending on the frame that surrounds it. These aspects are not mere details. In art history, they have to be taken into account in order to understand what the work conveys. Importantly, a story is not isolated from everything else, be it society, politics, geography, the audience, and so on. In the case of video games, stories coexist along gameplay and all the other elements of the game, because each of them inform and enrich what the story is. All that to say that story is not singular, but plural, and that even the least story-driven work contains stories. Consider a game such as Slay the Spire. No one knows the story of the game nor really cares. The player engages with the gameplay, with the intricate deck-building system that's about it. And yet, the game does have a story since it contains elusive dialogues and world-building moments when the player is confronted with a tough decision. What's more is that story, as we mentioned, is not solely about text, nor about the classic ways to do narration, such as cinematics, dialogues, or exposition scenes. In Slay the Spire, a roguelike game, story is present in the concept of ascensions, the name given to the runs the players go through in order to reach the spire. That simple premise, however simplistic it may be, is a form of narration and storytelling, one that gives the player an objective while interacting with the gameplay. With each new run comes a tacit desire to reach the spire. In this case, story is always in the back of the player's mind, however insignificant it appears to be. Zelda Breath of the Wild does it too, when it gives the player one and only one goal for the rest of the game: destroy Ganon. Story doesn't need to be grandiloquent to exist, as its primary benefit is to build coherence, to link things together, like a binding agent between all the other elements of the game. To go further, we may want to look at the games designed by Fumito Ueda, namely Ico, Shadow of the Colossus, and The Last Guardian. While Slay the Spire and Zelda are considered to be gameplay-centered games, the works of Ueda are fascinating in that they are story-driven games that do not contain much story. The little stories they have is elusive and obtuse, composed of fragmented dialogues and scenes which requires the player to piece things together on their own. In the case of Shadow of the Colossus, not much happens for most of the game, because narration appears when we don't usually see it. That is, in the silent moments when we ride toward yet another Colossus, or when we kill these giants and watch them disappear. The story of the game exists all around and without words, in moments of heroism when we climb a giant, to moments of despair and regret when we take them down. In fact, story arises when we experience down times, riding our horse toward the next destination. Since there's not much to do but ride and contemplate this beautiful world, we have time to think about our actions and what they mean. The presumed absence of story can hide a form of narration requiring us to ponder over our actions on our own, a meditating time which in fact allows us to understand what's going on and the true impact of our presence in the game's world. In many ways, a silent story can be just as evocative, if not more evocative, than one which contains thousands of words. Shadow of the Colossus is a fascinating example of story that seems optional and ignorable, but ends up being present all the time, because it is impossible for the player to dissociate their actions from what the game tries to evoke. Contrary to the many games which contain story and lore to be read or listened to on the side, Ueda's games do not divide story from gameplay. As a result, the player's imagination doesn't try to decipher the content of the game, but rather, and more interestingly, the player keeps trying to understand what it is that they are doing. What can their actions mean, and how they are impacting the game's world? This reversal, where a story is not about understanding the world, but more so understanding ourselves and what we are doing in that world, is part and parcel of what interactive forms of storytelling can do. Speaking of which, another incredible example of story intertwined with gameplay comes from What Remains of Edith Finch, and in particular a scene in which the player embodies Lewis Finch, a young man who works at a fish cannery, chopping fishes' heads all day long. Gameplay here becomes so numbingly repetitive, at first, that the player experiences the same dullness Lewis feels in his life, along with his need for escapism. So much so that the gameplay itself starts changing, adding another layer that enriches both the systems and the narration. In this example, Lewis starts imagining a fictional world that will be more and more developed as time goes by, which translates on screen in the gameplay being divided into two. One part dedicated to chopping fish, the other dedicated to the fictional world. Lewis's desperation and growing desire to escape his life is gradually felt when the fictional world takes more and more space on screen, but also in his real life, to the point where the screen is now taking over reality, and Lewis dies. The tragedy of his death hits much stronger given how the player's actions participate in the narration and the story of Lewis. In effect, we too, as players, desire to escape from the repetitive task at the fish cannery. We too wish for an uncharted fictional world where we would be exploring and having thrilling adventures. By holding the player hostage and making them experience a fragment of Lewis's life and his soul-draining work, the game transforms the repetitive button mashing of the controller into a repetitive fish chopping, elevating story to new heights video games rarely do. And this example is precisely how games can provide new and phenomenal stories that are unique and refreshing. Stories through which the act of playing participates in both writing a story and reading it. Thus far, all the games mentioned in this essay show how developers succeed in building strong and new narrations, but it is just as interesting to see how games can fail at it. Borderlands 3 is a famous example of this, as many players consider it to be a low point in the series, with a half-baked scenario full of bad jokes and awkward references to streamers. So yes, the story of Borderlands 3 is downright bad if not mediocre. In fact, this third entry embodies a common issue found in games, an emphasis on gameplay to the detriment of the rest. A poor narration is often considered acceptable as long as the game remains enjoyable to play. People go so far as to incentivize others to play without listening to dialogues, and to replace the audio with a podcast or some music. But doing so comes at a price, as it removes what a game is uniquely capable of offering, an entertainment that brings together interactive gameplay with music, aesthetics, and story. None of these elements should be removed or put aside. In fact, Borderlands 3 falls short the moment players wish to play the game with no dialogues, because doing so dismisses the context, that is, elements such as the world, the characters, the atmosphere, the lore, etc., all of which make the game what it is. Let's go back for a moment and imagine playing Shadow of the Colossus, but only playing the action sequences, thus removing all the downtimes when the player has to travel to their next destination. As we argued, this downtime is part and parcel of the narration, of the player's immersion in the game. These calm moments are essential in allowing us to think, ponder, and reflect on our actions within the fictional world we traverse. Playing without these moments would change the core nature of the game, and what it tries to convey. In sum, downtimes participate in the narration just as much as more classic, text-driven moments, and they cannot be removed nor ignored. Or we would lose what the game is about if it were to happen. Story is not optional. Such a statement asserts that having a mediocre narration to the benefit of gameplay doesn't hold. For the latter to thrive, it requires all the other elements to be just as solid. A story can be discrete, brief, or even silent. It can recede in the background for a specific purpose, but it doesn't mean it is less powerful or interesting. Borderlands 3 is considered a story-rich game, and yet its story is not as solid as the one in Spire, however small and inconsequential the latter may be. To reiterate an important point so that there's no confusion, a story doesn't necessarily equate to dialogues or exposition. A story can take many different forms, and good storytelling doesn't reside in the amount of lines written for a character or in the number of pages of text a game contains. A game with barely any words, or a game that is recognized first and foremost for its gameplay, may have a deeper and more interesting story than it seems. And vice versa, a game with a ton of text may have a weak story despite how verbose it is. Take Pillars of Eternity 2 for instance, which I find it to be an amazing game. Its main plot is rather weak, especially considering how story-driven this CRPG is. However, and paradoxically, its writing is superb, and in my opinion one of the best Medium has to offer. So we are confronted here with a story that's supposed to be bad and yet manages to contain excellent writing and style. Pillars 2 thus still contains strong storytelling, found in side quests and other small-scale moments, which is where the game truly shines. Environment storytelling is also a big part of the narration, just like in games such as Bioshock, whose story may not be the best there is, but the way it is presented to the player still works to this day, and remains brilliant in its narrative and level design. Now, I'd like to showcase the most puzzling example of how story can be presented and changed in games. And that example is, oddly enough, Fallout 76. The history behind the game is fascinating because it highlights a shift from Bethesda vis-à-vis their handling of the story. As you probably know, Fallout 76 was released without any human NPC characters in the game. Back then, the wasteland was truly a wasteland, and the only humans around were the players themselves. That choice from the developers was poorly received, to say the least, as players complained about the story feeling empty, lazy, and lacking meaningful interactions with the world and its inhabitants. In an expansion entitled Wastelanders, released 2 years after the original game, Bethesda reintegrated human characters in the world, while adding more quests and storylines to the game. The expansion strikes as an apologetic message sent to the players, and the recognition that story is not optional, leaning to the integration of a more robust narrative to the game. It seems then that we have here a perfect case of how story is not to be cast aside regardless of the genre and priorities a game may have. And yet, the story of Fallout 76 is actually more complicated than that, because I would argue that the game still has a poor story to this day, just as poor as before if not worse. This latest statement may sound contradictory because, after all, the game got an expansion that developed the story further. But the real question we ought to ask is, does adding more story to a game result in a better story? Of course, you already know the answer to that question. In the case of Fallout 76, the original setting of the game and its bold move to have no human NPCs was very interesting. It brought something new to the post-apocalyptic genre that we barely see, a truly empty world, one in which there is no one else around, and all you can see is traces, remnants of humankind through tapes and audio logs. That setting was not the problem of the game. Rather, it was the fact that Bethesda failed at making an interesting story out of it, turning that world into a roller coaster with no meaningful content, except for a few jokes and the possibility to bomb the environment just for the fun of it. Integrating human NPCs didn't necessarily change the quality of the story, as it is still driven by the same uncompelling narrative, given how the game's nature is being laser-focused on a meaningless item shop designed to make players spend money. Obviously, an essay on story has to mention the Souls series, if only because players can avoid dealing with the story in these games if they wish to. From Software deliberately creates narratives displayed via obtuse, cryptic item descriptions or NPC encounters, which some players decide to ignore. It seems then that Dark Souls and its peers stand as a perfect example where story is optional. But is it truly? As we saw, story takes many different forms, and the Souls series is famously renowned for how strong its environmental design is, so strong that it can tell a story on its own, while the player traverses the world. In many ways, the Souls games tell a story about space, the space we see in all its desolation, but also, and most importantly, the space we traverse, which is intricate and mesmerizing. Looking back at Dark Souls 1, the most endearing element of the game has to be the interconnected world and how we marveled at the sight of Firelink Shrine each time we kept circling back to it and its famous bonfire. On that note, Bonfires refer to the art of storytelling, more specifically, the oral tradition of telling supernatural or horrific stories around a fire. This correlation implies that the place where stories are told became, in the Souls series, an iconic place of respite. This is no mere coincidence. The most iconic place in the series is one infused with storytelling, and it means that if the Souls games make story optional, they remain purposefully haunted by it. In his latest book entitled The Crisis of Narration, Byung-Chul Han tells a tale of a boy named Conrad, who doesn't know how to tell stories. Conrad's family, on the other hand, is rather fond of telling stories anytime they can, be it his mother, his father, and even his little sister who starts enjoying the process despite her young age. This tale reads like a tragedy, because of Conrad's inability to talk about the world in an enchanted manner. Rather, he only details his life using facts, and facts only. For him, narrating consists in the enumeration of facts, nothing more. When his sister asks him what he did the day before, he replies, "Yesterday I was in school. First we had math, then German, then biology, and then 2 hours of sports. Then I went home and did my homework. Then I spent some time at the computer, and later I went to bed." For Conrad, everything in the world is intelligible, and the events of the day are reduced to pieces of clear and unambiguous information, as if he was holding a journal in his hands, announcing out loud the news of the day. A world which is only made of facts is a world without story. The indifference of facts clashes with the need we have, more than ever, to re-enchant a world which has lost its mystery. For Conrad's family, story is a way through which people can evoke, imagine, conceive a life that is filled with potential and humanity. Story, then, resembles evocation, a word that defines the act of bringing something up, imagining, creating. Nowadays, too many games offer little to no story. They do not try to evoke, to spark and excite the imagination. Instead, they present facts to the player, which results in story becoming nothing more than an article on the front pages of the latest newspapers. This is story without telling. It lacks a proper intonation, a tone, a human je ne sais quoi that transforms cold-hearted information into human language. To tell a good story is to share an experience that has a profound impact on us. I can tell you all about my adventures in Zelda Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, like the time I launched a Korok or when I dived from the sky toward the ground. I can tell you all about my adventures in Sea of Thieves, like the time I was attacked by another player when I was trying to sell some goods, and we fought for what seemed like an eternity, at the end of which I won by the skin of my teeth. I can tell you all about my adventures in Elden Ring, like the time I got invaded by an enemy player while fighting a boss with friendly players, resulting in absolute chaos as we were all fighting each other and dodging the boss's attacks. The scenarios of these games may not be as lengthy or profound as some other games, and yet they offer us a world in which we experiment and from which we draw in stories. When I say story is not optional, I mean that the best games provide a good script to follow, but they also ignite in us the enthusiasm to share our most endearing experiences, the ones that will stay in us forever. A good game's story escapes the confines of the game to infiltrate our everyday life, sparkling a desire to share what we experienced to others around, and thus turning us into proper storytellers. The tale of Conrad shares the same fate. After his parents discover his inability to tell stories, they send him to a house where he experiences bizarre and unexplainable things, like impossible geometries and nonsensical languages. When the little boy comes back home, a spark in his eyes, he starts telling the story of what happened to him. Conrad's excitement is met with joy from his family, who sees him being a kid again. A kid whose imagination has been recovered and whose world has found its renewed wonder. Conrad is happy to experience something new, but also happy to experience it with others. Because, in the end, and no matter how we put it, the most important element for any story is a simple fact that it's worth sharing.
ありがとよ。そうこなくっちゃ。おい、帰ろうぜ。